Hi there, night owls. Tonight, we're heading to a city that experienced the most unexpected twist of fate. 1 minute, it was a bustling port full of wine, gossip, and shady deals. And the next, it became a time capsule buried under 6 meters of volcanic fury. Pompeii, the ancient Roman city everyone thinks they know from history class. But here's the thing. This wasn't some sleepy little Italian town. It was basically the ancient version of New York colliding with Miami, where merchants from 3 continents jostled in the marketplace, and you could hear half a dozen languages before you even finished breakfast. Before we dive into that chaos, tap like if you're ready to see Pompeii like never before, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love knowing who's traveling with me. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's slip back 2,000 years into a city that was more complex, more diverse, and far more alive than any textbook ever told you. Because tonight, we're walking the streets of the real Pompeii. And trust me, it looks nothing like the postcard version. Ready? Let's go. So, let's talk about what Pompeii really was before Vesuvius decided to hit the full reset button. Picture it. Around 79 CE, and you're standing on the docks of Pompeii on the Bay of Naples. The air smells like seawater mixed with fish sauce. And yes, we'll come back to that particular Roman obsession, I promise. Everywhere you look, there's movement. Ships from across the Mediterranean are unloading their cargo. Merchants are shouting prices in half a dozen different languages. Someone is arguing about the exchange rate between Roman denarii and Egyptian drachmas. And honestly, currency conversion back then was just as irritating as it is today when you're trying to figure out whether that souvenir is actually a good deal. This wasn't a sleepy provincial town where everyone knew everyone's business. And the most exciting event of the year was the Harvest Festival. No, Pompeii was a real hub, a crossroads where cultures collided, traded, ate each other's food, borrowed each other's gods, and sometimes fought over bad deals. A place where you might meet a trader from Alexandria at breakfast, buy Spanish olive oil from another merchant at lunch, and overhear someone switching between Greek, Oscan, and Latin in the same argument about whether the fish was actually fresh that morning. For a long time, historians sort of assumed Pompeii was, well, Italian, Roman, full of Romans doing Roman things in a very Roman way. It seemed like a reasonable assumption, right? And then modern science walks in with a metaphorical folder of DNA results and says, actually, we need to talk. Recent genetic studies of skeletal remains found in Pompeii revealed something that would have confused ancient immigration officials if such people had existed. The population was incredibly diverse. We're talking about people with ancestry from all across the Italian peninsula, sure, but also a significant number whose DNA traces back to the Eastern Mediterranean, modern-day Turkey, Greece, Lebanon, and North Africa, mostly Egypt, but other regions too. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Pompeii wasn't tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It sat right on one of the most important waterways of the ancient world, at the height of Roman power, when the Mediterranean Sea was basically a Roman lake, called, without a hint of irony, Mare Nostrum, our sea. If you could sail there, someone eventually did, and they probably tried to sell you something when they arrived. The Roman Empire was many things: brutal, efficient, sometimes insane. But it was also, almost accidentally, multinational in a way that still surprises modern people. As long as you paid your taxes and didn't cause too much trouble, nobody really cared where you were from or which gods you worshipped at home. Their version of cultural diversity was basically, do what you want, just don't disrupt trade, and don't forget who's in charge. So Pompeii became this extraordinary melting pot of cultures, which must have made everyday life absolutely chaotic, in the best possible sense of the word. Imagine the forum, the marketplace, on any morning. Local campanians selling vegetables and grain, Egyptian merchants advertising papyrus and exotic perfumes, Greek traders bargaining over wine and philosophy, usually in that order, Syrian businessmen running the textile trade, North African merchants offering everything from wild animals for the arena to luxury delicacies. The language situation alone must have been a nightmare for anyone trying to do business without speaking at least 3 languages. Latin was the official language, the language of law and administration, and all those dull official documents the Roman bureaucracy loved producing. But out on the streets, in shops, taverns, and brothels, you'd hear Oscan, the local native language that existed before Roman conquest. You'd hear Greek because educated Romans spoke Greek the way modern professionals speak English. It was the language of culture, refinement, and showing off at dinner parties. You'd hear Aramaic from Syrian merchants, Punic from North African traders, probably some Egyptian, and definitely some sloppy attempts at translation when someone's wine-soaked brain couldn't remember which language they started the sentence in. The graffiti on Pompeii's walls, and there's a lot of it, because apparently humans have always loved writing random things on surfaces they don't own, reflects that linguistic chaos. Most of it is in Latin, of course, but you also find Greek phrases, Oscan words, even the occasional attempt to write Punic in a script the writer clearly didn't know how to form properly. One piece of graffiti translates to something like, "I baked bread," which sounds aggressively mundane until you realize it was probably written by a baker who had just learned to write and was wildly proud of that fact. Another one says, "Let the one who loves prosper. Let the one who does not know love perish," which is either very romantic or very dramatic, depending on how much wine the author had. Unfortunately, they didn't leave timestamps or sobriety ratings. But let's get back to this multinational city and what that really meant for daily life. The Macellum, the market building, would have been the beating heart of this international exchange. Archaeologists have found evidence that goods from across the known world passed through Pompeii's shops and stalls. Spanish fish sauce, which apparently was the premium brand if you were picky about your fermented seafood products. North African grain, wine from all across Italy and beyond, luxury items from the East, silk, spices, gemstones, glass from Egypt and Syria, because Romans became absolutely obsessed with glass as soon as they figured out how to make it decorative, not just functional. The food situation alone must have been wild. Traditional Italian staples, grain, vegetables, olive oil, meat, wine, sitting right alongside imported delicacies that would have seemed unbelievably exotic to anyone who had never left their hometown. Dates from North Africa, spices from the far reaches of the empire and beyond, carried along trade routes that connected Rome with India, and even China, though the Romans had only a vague idea where that silk was actually coming from. Their geography got a little fuzzy beyond Persia, and honestly, they didn't care much about details as long as the luxury goods kept arriving. Taverns and street food vendors, Thermopolia as they were called, offered another option for people who couldn't or didn't want to cook at home. These were the ancient Roman equivalents of fast food spots, and Pompeii was absolutely packed with them. Recent excavations suggest that in this relatively small city there were more than 80 thermopolia, which either means Romans really loved eating out, or a large part of the population didn't have decent cooking facilities at home. Probably both, to be honest. A thermopolium was basically a shop with a counter fitted with large clay jars, dolia, filled with hot food sold to passers-by. You could find stews, soups, hot wine, and probably some kind of quick bread or grain-based snack. The quality ranged from decent to questionable, depending on the place and on how much you were willing to pay. Frescoes and decorations in some of these spots suggest they had regular customers and a certain pride in what they served. Others were probably the ancient equivalent of that sketchy late-night place you only visit when you're drunk and desperate. But even street food wasn't equally available to every class. The wealthy might grab a snack at a thermopolium while they were out on business, but for them it was a choice, not a necessity. The poor depended on these places because they didn't have private kitchens. They didn't have enslaved cooks. They didn't have the space or the equipment to prepare food at home. A tiny room in an insula, an apartment block, might have a small brazier for warmth, but nothing you could call a real kitchen. So you bought hot food from vendors, which meant spending money every single day on meals that were probably less nutritious than home cooking, but were your only practical option. And then, at the very bottom of this social hierarchy, we have to talk about enslaved people. Because any discussion of Roman society that doesn't include slavery is telling a fundamentally dishonest story. Slavery was everywhere in Pompeii. It was woven into every aspect of the economy and daily life so completely that you can't separate one from the other. Modern estimates suggest that perhaps a third of Pompeii's population was enslaved, meaning roughly 1 out of every 3 people you passed on the street was legally considered property. Enslaved people did everything. They worked in wealthy homes as cooks, cleaners, personal servants, tutors, entertainers, secretaries. They labored in shops and workshops, producing goods and running businesses for their owners. They worked the farms around the city, cultivating the fertile volcanic soil that made Campania rich. They ran taverns and thermopolia. They did the hot, dangerous, exhausting work in bakeries. Pompeii had at least 30 commercial bakeries, and they were largely staffed by enslaved people, working in conditions that would violate every modern labor law at once. Bakeries are especially revealing because we can see exactly how the work was done. Grain had to be ground into flour, which meant turning massive millstones by hand, or more often, forcing enslaved people to lead donkeys or other animals in circles for hours. The work was repetitive, dull, and physically crushing. Then the flour had to be kneaded into dough, shaped into loaves, and baked in large ovens that made the workspace unbearably hot. A shift in a Pompeian bakery meant spending hours in heat that would make modern factory conditions look comfortable. Producing bread you probably couldn't even afford to buy yourself. The bones of enslaved people found in Pompeii tell stories of heavy labor and physical strain. They show signs of arthritis and joint problems in young adults, evidence of repetitive stress from constant work. They show healed fractures that never received proper medical care. They show malnutrition because enslaved people ate the cheapest food their owners could provide, enough to keep them working and not much more. Isotope analysis suggests that the people at the very bottom of the food ladder were enslaved, surviving on scraps, leftovers, and cheap grain. Some enslaved people in Pompeii lived better than others. A grim sentence to write, but it reflects the reality of Roman slavery. Those working in wealthy households, especially if they had valuable skills, might receive decent treatment, enough food, even occasional privileges. A talented cook or an educated secretary could be valued enough to get better living conditions, and the possibility, one day, of buying their freedom or being freed by a grateful owner. Enslaved people working in shops with regular contact with free customers might have had a little more autonomy, maybe even the chance to earn tips or small amounts of money on the side. But better still meant being property. It meant having no legal rights, no protection from violence, no ability to refuse unwanted sexual advances from an owner, no escape if you were beaten, sold, or separated from your family. It meant your children were born into slavery, automatically belonging to your owner. It meant everything in your life, where you lived, what you ate, what work you did, who you could marry, if you were even allowed to marry, was subject to someone else's whims. The kindest owner in Pompeii still owned people, and no amount of good treatment changes that fundamental cruelty. Latin barely had a word for enslaved people as individuals. They were servi, slaves, defined entirely by their status as property. Romans discussed them in economic terms, as investments to be managed for maximum return. Legal texts debated whether you could return an enslaved person who turned out to be unsatisfactory, as if they were defective merchandise. Even sympathetic Romans, who wrote about treating enslaved people well, did it in the language of property management. Treat your tools well, so they last longer. That was the logic. The idea that enslaved people might have inherent human rights was so far from Roman thinking that they barely had the conceptual vocabulary to express it. The layout of Pompeian homes reflects this hierarchy. Enslaved people in wealthy houses usually slept in the smallest, worst rooms, sometimes literally under staircases or in corners of kitchens. They had no privacy, no personal space, no refuge from work, because their workplace and their living space were the same. A wealthy family lived in decorated splendor just a few meters away, sleeping in comfortable beds, eating rich food, entirely dependent on enslaved labor, while treating enslaved people as barely human. In workshops and commercial spaces, enslaved people often lived on site, sometimes chained to prevent escape. Archaeologists have found evidence of shackles, chains, small locked rooms that served as prisons for enslaved people considered likely to run. The famous Villa of the Mysteries outside the city walls includes a room that appears to have been a prison for enslaved workers, with traces of restraints. The everyday cruelty of it is staggering. Keeping human beings in chains while they performed the labor that made your business profitable. We know from ancient graffiti and records that enslaved people ran away whenever they could. There were professional slave catchers who made a living tracking fugitives and returning them for a reward. Notices about runaway enslaved people have been found in various Roman cities, describing the person, offering payment, threatening punishment. The fact that escapes were common enough to support an entire industry tells you everything you need to know about how enslaved people felt about their conditions. Some enslaved people in Pompeii managed to buy their freedom. The Romans had a legal process of manumission, where enslaved people could become freedmen, liberti, though they still owed obligations to their former owners and occupied an awkward in-between position in society. No longer enslaved, but not fully equal citizens. Freedmen could own property, run businesses, even become wealthy, but they carried social stigma and legal restrictions. Their children, born after manumission, would be free citizens, which gave people a reason to endure continued subordination in hopes of a better future for the next generation. The Romans thought this system was generous, which says a lot about Roman values. Tombstones and memorial inscriptions in the necropolis outside Pompeii's walls show one last expression of this hierarchy. Even in death, the wealthy had large monuments, elaborate tombs, inscriptions praising their virtues and listing achievements. They were buried with valuable grave goods, jewelry, coins, ceramics, everything they might need in the afterlife, if the afterlife accepted material bribes. Their tombs lined the roads leading into the city, basically billboards advertising a family's status forever. Poorer free citizens had simpler markers, smaller spaces, maybe just a name carved into stone, if anything at all. Many were probably buried in communal graves or paupers' fields that left little archaeological trace. Enslaved people, unless they were especially valued or had managed to save enough to buy a burial place, often ended up in unmarked graves. In life, they left minimal archaeological footprints because they owned nothing, built nothing with their names on it, and were deliberately excluded from memorial practices that might have preserved their memory. The social geography of Pompeii mapped this hierarchy onto physical space. The best real estate, large plots near the Forum, homes with sea views, properties near important public buildings, belonged to the wealthy. Commercial districts mixed classes because trade happened there. But even there you could read the social order. Who owned the shops and who worked inside them? The question arises that death deserves privacy, and that educational benefits do not necessarily justify the violation of dignity represented by public display. Facial reconstructions add another layer of ethical complexity because they make identification feel more personal, even though it is not truly possible. When you look at bones, there is a clinical distance that makes the remains feel like scientific specimens. But when you look at a reconstructed face, suddenly you see a person, and the violation can feel far more intimate. Reconstruction creates a semblance of identity that may be inaccurate, yet feels real enough to generate emotional and ethical reactions. Is it more respectful to leave people as anonymous bones? Or does reconstruction actually honor their individuality? Different people arrive at different conclusions. There are also concerns about scientific reliability and the potential for misinterpretation. Facial reconstructions are approximations, not portraits. DNA analysis can be contaminated, and isotopic data can be ambiguous. The biographical stories researchers construct from this information are informed hypotheses, not definitive knowledge. When we present these reconstructions and stories to the public, do we clearly communicate the uncertainty involved? Or do we present speculation as fact because it creates better museum exhibits and more engaging stories? Research also has unequal impacts. Western scholars study remains from ancient sites, extract knowledge that advances their careers and institutions, and produce academic work primarily accessible to Western audiences. The source communities, in this case modern Italians living near Pompeii, do not necessarily receive equal benefits from this research. There are legitimate questions about who owns the past, who has the right to study it, and how the benefits and burdens of archaeological research should be distributed. Colonialism and extraction are not only about physical artifacts. They also apply to the production of knowledge and to who gains control over narratives about the past. So where does this leave us? Honestly, without easy answers. Different ethicists and archaeologists draw the line in different places. Some advocate for the broadest possible scientific research, arguing that the acquisition of knowledge justifies the methods used. Others advocate for minimal intervention and strict limits on what kinds of analyses are acceptable. Still others propose compromise positions. Conduct research, but do not display remains publicly. Allow study, but require reburial afterward. Extract information, but limit destructive sampling. Use facial reconstruction for research, but not for public exhibition. Many institutions have developed formal policies regarding human remains, requiring approval from ethics committees before research can begin, establishing standards for respectful handling and storage, consulting descendant communities when possible, and attempting to balance scientific goals with cultural sensitivity. These policies vary widely between countries and institutions, reflecting different cultural values and legal frameworks. What is acceptable in one place may be forbidden in another, and the debate continues over whether international standards should be established or whether local variation is more appropriate given different cultural contexts. The ancient dead of Rome cannot participate in these discussions, which is precisely the problem. They have no descendants who can claim authority to speak on their behalf. There is no living cultural community that continues their religious or burial traditions. They have no legal status that protects their hypothetical preferences. They are voiceless, and we make decisions about their bodies based on our own values, priorities, and interests. The best we can do is try to balance competing considerations: scientific value, educational benefit, cultural respect, and human dignity, while acknowledging that perfect solutions do not exist. Some researchers approach this work with explicit rituals of respect, recognizing the humanity of the remains they study, even while treating them as scientific material. Before beginning analysis, they may pause to acknowledge that these were real people who deserve consideration. During research, they handle remains carefully and minimize invasive procedures. After research is completed, they ensure proper storage and protection. These practices do not resolve the fundamental ethical dilemmas, but they represent attempts to maintain human connection and respect within a scientific framework that inevitably objectifies its subjects. The question of what we owe the ancient dead may ultimately have no definitive answer. Different ethical frameworks lead to different conclusions. Utilitarian approaches emphasize maximizing knowledge and benefits, suggesting that extensive research is justified if it produces valuable information. Deontological approaches focus on duties and rules, potentially concluding that the requirements of consent and respect for the dead limit acceptable research regardless of the benefits. Virtue ethics asks what kind of people we want to be and what qualities of character we cultivate. Does this work make us more curious and knowledgeable, or more willing to objectify and exploit the powerless? Religious and spiritual perspectives add further complexity. If you believe in an afterlife where intact bodies matter, disturbing burials and destroying tissue samples for DNA analysis becomes deeply problematic. If you believe that consciousness ends at death, and the body is simply organic matter, then Respect for the dead may be more about cultural practices and the feelings of the living than obligations toward the deceased themselves. If you believe the dead continue to exist in some form and can be honored through memory and study, then research might be seen as a form of respect rather than violation. These metaphysical questions shape ethical conclusions, but cannot be resolved through empirical research. The public dimension of this work also matters. When museums display plaster casts and reconstructions, they are making choices about representation, narrative, and who gets to be seen and remembered. Spectacular deaths, people caught in dramatic poses, children, families, receive attention and reconstruction work. Less photogenic remains, scattered bones, partial skeletons, unspectacular deaths receive far less attention. This creates a biased sample in which some ancient individuals are remembered and individualized, while others remain anonymous. Is that ethical? Perhaps. Perhaps it is also inevitable. The selection of who gets studied, reconstructed, and displayed reflects modern values and interests just as much as ancient realities. There is also the question of how long these ethical obligations persist. The dead of Pompeii have been buried for 2,000 years. The culture they belong to no longer exists. No one alive has personal memories of them or direct cultural continuity with their way of life. Does this temporal distance change the ethical calculation? Should we treat remains that are 2,000 years old differently from those that are 200 or 20? Most societies do draw temporal boundaries in law and practice. Archaeological excavation of ancient sites is legal and accepted, while disturbing recent graves is a crime. But exactly where that line should be drawn and why remains debated. Some argue that temporal distance actually increases our obligation to study and remember the dead. Otherwise, they will be completely forgotten. The further back in time we go, the more fragile the connection between past and present becomes, and the more important it is to actively preserve memory and knowledge. From this perspective, leaving ancient remains unstudied is abandonment rather than respect, a failure to honor the dead by ensuring that their existence is remembered and that their lives contribute to human knowledge.